And joining me now to talk more about the recovery efforts across New York is the Director of State Operations, Howard Glaser. Thanks very much for your time.
You bet.
So you've been traveling around the state. You're basically the governor's point man on all these recovery efforts. Just if you could tell us, you also participated in the Labor for Your Neighbor event over the weekend as well, events we should say. If you could tell us just from your personal point of view, what have you seen from some of the destruction from this storm? And just what sort of impact is it having on these communities?
You know, I'll tell you, unless you've actually seen it with your own eyes, it's hard to appreciate the destructive impact of water. You know, it's literally thousands of tons of water hitting these buildings at a high velocity does damage that's just extraordinary. In the town of Prattsville, which I think is at least visibly the most damaged town, homes have been knocked off their foundations. They've had big pieces torn out of them. It's common to see large vehicles a quarter mile or more from the roadway having been washed into a cornfield. We've been to farms whose entire crops for the season have been wiped out. Mm-hmm. So whether it's in some of the smaller communities like Middleburg or Schoharie or Prattsville, or right into the valley where the farmers are working, you've had just incredibly broad impact in undermining the social fabric and the economic fabric of these communities.
And it's also hit some of the poorest parts of the state too. The Catskills and the North Country were deeply impacted by this. Also areas that depend on a lot of tourism too.
Right.
I mean, I'm sure it's difficult to quantify how much money was lost from the Labor Day weekend for the North Country, Keene Valley. But you participated in the Labor for Your Neighbor events. What was that like, and just what was the response from some of the residents out there?
Well, just to explain what Labor for Your Neighbor was, when the governor was in Margaretville, I think the second time, he's been up there 3 times now, that's one of the communities in the Catskills that was impacted, and we were there a few days ago, and really what we saw were that it was neighbors helping neighbors, carrying debris out of a building, taking mud out, sweeping down the streets just to make their community more livable. And you saw that it wasn't just the government effort that was having an impact, but people helping each other out. The governor said, you know, I've had so many people around the state say, how can I help? Why don't we see if we can bring volunteers up here? So I think on Friday morning we posted on our website, and the governor announced if people wanted to volunteer to help just like those neighbors in these communities, that we would assist them in doing so. We had a tremendous response, and we took over 1,000 people over the the Labor Day weekend to a number of the locations around the state. Not an easy thing to do. They were somewhat inaccessible. We brought them in by bus. Walmart and Home Depot provided food and supplies and safety equipment. The National Guard put together a task list, and we deployed 1,000 people to help clean up the communities. I think this was an extraordinary had extraordinary impact for those who participated. I know it was very moving for them.
How many volunteers did you have?
We had 1,000 volunteers. 1,000 volunteers, yeah.
From all over the state?
From all over the state.
Where were they coming from?
They came. We had people coming down. We had, I think we had some nuns coming up from New York City. We had members of the Olympic bobsled team up in Keene helping out. We had a lot of state employees that answered the call, and then just average citizens who wanted to help out. So it was a tremendous outpouring, and I think that the people in the towns, you know, as much as it was actual help in cleaning up their homes and their businesses, it was also that sense that they're not alone, that somebody's there to help them, that other New Yorkers cared enough to be there with them to help them out.
Is that statewide damage assessment still at $1 billion that figure the governor gave a couple of days ago?
That's about what we believe. You know, we haven't really focused so much on adding up the numbers. We've really been focused on actually helping the recovery process. But we're beginning to look now. We've gone out to our state agencies and local partners, asked them for an assessment of the costs. The $1 billion cost the governor talked about is at approximately a total amount of damage. Much of that, we hope, will be privately insured or otherwise taken care of by private interests. The amount to the state is harder to pin down at this point in terms of what the costs will be. The costs to local government, we know they'll be substantial, but a lot of that $1 billion will be covered by insurance and other ways of paying for it.
Okay, and the whole effort that the governor, and it really seemed highlighted late last week when the governor put out that statement about the Long Island Power Authority and National Grid trying to get the lights back on. I think yesterday morning was down to about 91 people or 91 households who still didn't have their power back on.
Right.
Just what was the issue with LIPA and National Grid, who they're the ones who basically maintain the lines down there. LIPA is in charge of it, Long Island Power Authority. But what was the issue where they were basically struggling to reconnect everyone?
Well, first, I think your point is well taken about LIPA and National Grid. Most people don't realize that, LIPA doesn't actually run the transmission and distribution system. They do that by contract. Currently, the contract is with National Grid, and that contract will be up for renewal again. So one of the things that we'll be directing LIPA to look at is the kind of storm emergency response and doing a better job than LIPA has done in the past. Long Island was out for longer than it should have been. That's no rap on the electrical workers that were working very hard all through the night, sometimes in dangerous conditions. The resources just weren't there to get it back far enough. The problem primarily with Long Island is that at a certain point, after you get past the substations and the bigger distribution points, it's backyard by backyard warfare, removing tree limbs and getting lines up, and it's just a house-to-house situation to bring some of the recovery back.
So who would be responsible for, if we can just stay on this topic for a little bit, who would be responsible for that recovery response and turning the lights back on? Is it the Long Island Power Authority, or is it National Grid? National
Grid is doing the work. They're responsible for doing it by contract. LIPA ultimately is responsible for providing the direction to National Grid to do the work. I think in the after-action report, when we look back at how both the state and utilities and local governments responded, this is one of the areas we'll have to look at, is how to do better with the utility companies.
Okay. And the federal response overall to the state, from your point of view, how has it been working with FEMA? You also had the Homeland Security Secretary here. How has their response been so far? And just what percentage, because I think a few percentages have been thrown out there in recent days, but just what percentage of the damage will they be able to pay for?
They've been great partners so far. As you mentioned, Secretary Napolitano was here firsthand, so was the administrator of FEMA, Craig Fugate, as was the Agriculture Secretary, Tom Vilsack. They all came, they saw firsthand. Their people are on the ground working. Jointly with FEMA, we've opened up 8 disaster recovery centers in all the affected counties. These are places where people can come to get their information about how to apply for FEMA help, insurance information. Those are open now, and they're open for business. To date, my understanding is about 9,000 New Yorkers have applied for FEMA assistance, and FEMA at this point has approved about $5.5 million of individual assistance to those people. The percentage that FEMA pays depends on whether it's individual assistance or picking up the cost that localities in the state have put in. For the state and public entity costs, FEMA picks up 75% of the cost. We're going to try to work with them to see if we can get that a bit higher. For individual assistance, depends on the program, depends on the damage. It can be up to $30,000 per individual to cover their losses and expenses.
Okay. And just from the point of view of the administration in the response to this, I think it's very hard to find anybody criticizing the response to this, because it seems like there was so much preparation. We saw the storm coming 5 days in advance, and everyone was mobilized to deal with this. But is there anything that you've learned that would have been that you could do differently? No. Like if there's another storm that comes and it's the exact same pattern and it goes up the river like it did this time around, what would be done differently?
Well, I think every incident like this, you're doing two things at once. You're trying to respond immediately to the needs that are there. You're also using it as a way to understand what works and what doesn't work and prepare better for the next time, and I'm sure we'll be able to do that. There are a couple of different areas I think we'll focus on. One is communications. It's very difficult to get good information and communicate well during the course of the storm itself, not so much the recovery. Some of the upstate areas that were hit, the communications cell service is marginal at best to begin with. Mm-hmm. You add to that cell towers go down. We had satellite phones with us that you couldn't reach a satellite signal. We've got to look at a better way to get communication between the local governments and the state and among the state.
That's one area. That make it more difficult to respond?
It created more difficulties in getting information out about where you needed to respond to. So, we could communicate to our own people. You need to go to this location. You need a search and rescue team here. But getting the information to us was always a little bit difficult. So we'll be looking at improving communications. I think also in terms of flood control, we've got to look at the embankments. We've got to have a better flood response plan. This was an unusual flood event, but it seems like we've seen more of these events in recent years. And I think the state and localities need to do more to focus on what are the at-risk areas, what is the plan for evacuation, and try to do those things even better than we did them this time.
Okay, and the overall recovery efforts, I know Route 73 up in the North Country is going to be reopened in about a week or so. When will this all return to normal, if there can be a normal for some of these communities?
You can return the bridges, and get the power lines going, and get the phones back up. I think there's still some psychological damage and some damage to the community economies that will be a little longer lasting. But it's important for us to get the roads open. You mentioned 73. We're committed to getting that open in 10 days. We're focused on Route 30 through the Schoharie Valley and Route 23 through the Catskills. Those are all lifeline roads. They're big priorities for us. Most of the roads that were damaged have been opened. There's about 29 roads that are closed now compared to over 250 before. We've got 13 bridges out compared to about double that right after the storm. So we'll repair that infrastructure. Longer term, it's economic revitalization, and it's things as important as the school districts. We've had in Middleburg and Windham, those schools were seriously damaged. We're working right now with those school districts to get the kids back to school. They'll be delayed a little bit, and we want to return that to normalcy as quickly as we can.
Okay, State Director of Operations Howard Glaser, unfortunately we're out of time, but thanks very much for coming on.
Thank you very much, Nick.